You've probably used or have heard of Sidechain Compression, but did you know there are a number of other really interesting ways to make use of sidechaining in Ableton Live? In this video, we'll take a look at all the different ways you can use sidechains in Live and how to get the most out of them. For this video, I'll assume you already know the basics of Sidechain Compression in Live, but we'll start with a quick recap and some tips and tricks to get the most out of the sidechain. We'll then look at some other places you can use sidechains in Live, like sidechain filtering and gating. We'll finish up with some even more advanced techniques to round out the sidechaining toolkit. The most common ways to use sidechains in music production is for sidechain compression. Let's start with a basic example and see how to set that up in Live. Here I have some synth chords and a kick drum pattern, and I want to add some groove to the synth. The simplest explanation of what sidechaining is using the signal from one track to affect the sound of another. In this example, I'll use the signal from the kick drum to compress the synth. I'll load Live's compressor onto the synth track and open up the sidechain section. I'll enable the sidechain and select the drums track as the sidechain source. One of the cool things about sidechains in Live is that if you select a drum rack as the source, you can select individual sounds from within that drum rack. In this example, I only want the sidechain to respond to the kick, not the shaker or rim that are also playing in this drum loop. So I can select just the kick drum from the second drop-down menu. Let's take a slight diversion here because there's often some confusion as to whether to select pre-effects, post-effects, or post-mixer from these options. Remember that sidechains work based on the level of the sidechain signal, and this could be different at different points in the signal chain. As an example, I'll select post-mixer for the entire drum track as the source. And now I have the current level of the drum track as the sidechain signal. But what if I turned down the level or muted the drum track? Now, there's no signal coming into the sidechain because the source is taking the level from after the mixer. If I change this to post effects, I still get level coming into the sidechain, even when the drums are muted. There's no right or wrong here, it just depends on what you're trying to achieve, so be aware of this when choosing your sidechain source. I'll switch this back to the kick drum and continue setting up some sidechain compression on the synth. I'll pull down the threshold to start getting some compression. You'll often want to tune the timing of the compressor using the attack and release controls. However, this is quite a boomy kick drum, so the envelope of the kick, which is triggering the compression, is already quite long. This can make it tricky to fine-tune the release. One trick you can use is to make use of the sidechain EQ to refine the sidechain signal. I'll solo the synth, and then enable Sidechain Listen, so I'm now hearing the signal that's coming into the sidechain. I'll also switch over to the compressor's envelope view, which makes it easier to see the envelope of the sidechain signal. Notice how the kick's envelope is relatively long. I'll enable the sidechain EQ and make sure it's on high pass. This is already making a difference, and you can see the envelope of the sidechain signal is much snappier, but we can take it further using the frequency and Q controls. Remember that we're currently only hearing the sidechain signal, so we won't actually hear this in the mix. Now I have a much shorter, clickier envelope. I'll turn Sidechain Listen off, and I now have much more accurate control over the attack and release values. Let's move on to the next device that can make use of a sidechain, the AutoFilter. I'll bring in the bass line. At the moment, this is just a series of sustained notes, but I want the bass to follow the rhythm of the kick. I'll load AutoFilter and pull the frequency all the way down. I'll open AutoFilter's Sidechain section, enable the sidechain, and select the kick drum as the source. In the AutoFilter, the amount of sidechain applied is set by the envelope control. If I turn that up, you'll hear that the frequency of the filter is being affected by the sidechain signal. If turning the envelope control all the way to the max is still not enough, you can always use the Sidechain gain control to increase the level of the sidechain signal. And, similar to the compressor, you can refine the timing of the response with the attack and release controls. The nice thing about this setup is that the rhythm of the bass will always follow the rhythm of the kick drum, even when the pattern changes. This works really nicely when you want a tight relationship between two elements in your track. Let's explore some sidechain gating. I have this percussion part. And this synth texture. I'd like the synth texture to only play when the snare in the percussion pattern hits. I'll load Live's gate onto the synth texture, open the sidechain, and select the perc track as the source. Already something interesting is happening, but I just want to isolate one element of the percussion loop. Unfortunately, the percussion is an audio loop, not a drum rack, so I can't select individual elements as a source. But there is another trick I can use, taking advantage of Live's flexible routing system. I'll create a new audio track. Let's call this Snare ISO. And I'll set the audio input to the perc track. I'll solo this. Set the monitor to in, the input to post effects, and mute the track so we won't hear it in the mix. Now I can use some effects to isolate just the element I want. Again, remember that we won't be hearing this in the mix, just using it as a sidechain source, so it doesn't matter what it sounds like. The goal here is to isolate the sound we want and turn it into a short impulse. Once I've isolated the bit I want, I'll head back to the synth texture and set the sidechain input of the gate to this new snare ISO track. And adjust the timing of the gate. You can use this technique anytime you need to isolate a particular element from a piece of audio to use as a sidechain source. While this next tool doesn't use sidechaining exactly, it works in the same way, using the signal from one track to affect something on another. This is the envelope follower, and I'll load it onto the snare ISO track. Envelope follower is a Max for Live device, so you will need Max for Live to use it, but we can do some pretty fun things with it. The envelope follower, as the name suggests, follows the envelope of whatever sound you place it on, similar to how sidechains work. However, we can map the envelope follower to control almost any parameter in Live. I've got a grain delay effect set up on return track B. I'll use the snare ISO track, which remember is the isolated snare from the perk track, to affect the send to the grain delay. On the envelope follower, click Map, then click on the control you want to map to. Then use the controls on the envelope follower to refine the results. Using the envelope follower, you can effectively sidechain anything to almost anything else in Live, which can be a pretty powerful tool. We'll wrap up with an odd but pretty interesting use of sidechains in Live. A side effect of the Sidechain Listen button is that it essentially lets you take a signal from anywhere in Live and listen to it anywhere else in Live. Let's see an example. I'll load another compressor onto the field keys track before this existing sidechain compressor, and set the sidechain input to any other track, let's say the bass. If I enable the Sidechain Listen, I can now hear the signal from the bass, but on the field keys track, and it will pass through any effects on that track, as you can hear with the grain delay send. Sidechain listening is obviously intended for auditioning your sidechain signals, as we've seen, but there's no reason you can't just leave this on. You could use the sidechain mix control to create a pseudo mix bus. You could group the compressor into a rack and create parallel chains. You can move this compressor anywhere else in your set and absolutely anywhere in the signal flow to arbitrarily route signals to anywhere in your signal chain. To be perfectly honest, I haven't really found many uses for this, but it's pretty interesting and could come in handy at some point. Let me know if you come up with anything interesting using this technique. And that's it for now. Which of these uses of sidechains was new to you, and which of them are you going to try in your next track? Let me know in the comments. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop those in the comments as well, and be sure to check out the links in the description for ways you can support Elephant and get more content for Ableton Live. Thanks for watching.